After an eventful few days for game announcements, last week Capcom announced and released current-gen console and PC versions for Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake, and Resident Evil 7. Ray tracing, higher resolutions, and support for 120Hz are all promised here, on all console platforms for all games. With so much to cover, we've had to split coverage into multiple videos for this one. So today we'll be looking at the remakes of Resident Evils 2 and 3 on console. Has Capcom's RT implementation advanced over the somewhat conservative approach used in Resident Evil Village? And can the consoles keep up with the demands of ray tracing and 120 FPS? We've got 3 consoles to cover today over 2 games, with 3 modes per console, for a total of 18 unique performance profiles. To keep it manageable here, we're going to be going mode by mode, starting with the most interesting option, the ray tracing mode. The Resident Evil remakes were great looking titles, but the reflections really weren't great. Like most last-gen titles, we saw a mix of cube maps and screen space reflections, combined to create the impression of sharp light reflections across the scene. We're looking at the Xbox One X release running on Series X here. The issue here is that the screen space reflections were of a low quality in my opinion. There were a few fundamental issues here. Most obviously, the SSR had a grainy, unstable resolve that had a rough appearance. Even in the best case circumstances, the screen space reflections didn't look great. The SSR exhibited some strange results in some scenes as well. The police station in Resident Evil 2 is a perfect example. Look at how intense the SSR is relative to the rest of the scene. It doesn't look like a reflection at all really, almost more like a heat shimmer or a mirage, as it is quite strong and only partially covers a highlight on a poorly lined cube map underneath. While we're looking at this scene, notice how as Leon moves forward, the silhouette of his body completely occludes that area in screen space, producing ugly occlusion artifacts. Screen space reflections will always produce some visually obvious artifacting when the scene is occluded like this, but third-person games typically use a variety of techniques to make occlusion artifacts less present in the final image. Aggressively culling the SSR around the character model can help, as can constraining the use of SSR to surfaces where the player character less frequently overlaps. Cube maps can also be used as a fallback when SSR suffers from occlusion issues, and with very careful placement, they can make SSR artifacts much less distracting. Unfortunately, the SSR implementations in these 2 games were relatively poor, especially considering the visual sophistication of the games elsewhere, so the promise of real-time ray tracing is intriguing here. To cut to the chase, we seem to be getting 2 techniques across these 2 games, RT reflections and RTGI. The RT reflections produce the most visually obvious changes. If we go back to that scene in the police station lobby, all the occlusion artifacts in the reflection are gone. The effect is much more stable, and it is much less intense. The effect isn't especially high resolution, it's probably rendering at a pretty small fraction of the rendering resolution for the overall scene, but it's a big improvement. Elsewhere in Resident Evil 2, we see similar results. The clarity of the effect depends on the roughness of the underlying material, with smooth surfaces seeing the cleanest results. Enemies are reflected in the RT as well, though alpha effects understandably don't make the cut. In general, the new RT reflections look subtle but stable, and are definitely an upgrade over the reflections that were present before. The only real disappointment here is that the RT reflections seem very selectively applied. This mirror, for instance, has no reflection of any kind, and transparencies don't seem to get RT treatment in general. Some of these materials do get box projected cube maps though, which look pretty decent. Resident Evil 3, interestingly enough, has a more thorough RT coverage from what I've played. This early section of the game in the subway station is a perfect showcase. These reflections of Jill in the diffuse metal look very good, as do the sharp reflections of Jill in the posters and in the window. And the environment in general features more glossy materials that are more suitable for RT. I did notice some weirdness in a few elements in RE3, like on this kettle, which receives a reflection that is way too bright for the material regardless of whether you have RT enabled or not, but the reflections are mostly quite consistent with the environment and surface properties. RTGI also seems to be in play here, though the results are generally on the subtle side. Some of the smaller inaccuracies present in the original release have been fixed. This light bleed in the police station is now gone, for instance. A bit of extra bounce lighting is visible in many scenes. It's not something you're likely to notice immediately, but running the games side by side there is a significant difference. This is definitely an additive technique, rather than a replacement for the existing baked GI, but the results are reasonable considering its limitations. The RTGI also seems to disable the screen space ambient occlusion, with somewhat mixed results. These RT features aren't a transformative improvement to the remake's visuals, but they do manage to address their most obvious visual flaws, while touching up some discontinuities in ambient lighting and shadowing, and are a welcome change. So how do the consoles stack up then? PS5 and Series X render an image that resolves at roughly 2160p, though sometimes the image seems to come in a little bit lower, but only slightly, at around 2016p. Series S, on the other hand, seems to be resolving a 1440p image. A form of image reconstruction, possibly checkerboarding, seems to be in use here, judging from the resolve on camera cuts and in hair. Still, all the machines look suitably clean and clear, though the image tends to be a bit soft across all platforms owing to a heavy reliance on post-processing. Other visual settings seem similar between the consoles, without significant differences. Series S does feature noticeably degraded reflections, however, which is likely a consequence of the cutback rendering resolution. Relative to the old One X version running on Series X, which ran at 1620p with reconstruction, image quality is indeed improved, though the differences are often subtle despite a fairly large increase in resolution on the new Series X code. Fine detail like hair is improved, and distant textures resolve somewhat more clearly, but in typical play it doesn't seem far off. Performance in the RT modes isn't great, unfortunately. PS5 and Series X are mostly in 40 to 60 FPS territory, in a bit of a framerate no man's land. Constant jutter and inconsistent input are the result on a conventional display. Series S suffers somewhat more and generally operates around 30 to 50 FPS, with a low of 26 FPS during one particularly demanding cutscene. So in the end, I have mixed opinions about the RT modes. On the one hand, they do manage to achieve significant visual improvements through an additive, scalable use of ray tracing. On the RDNA 2 derived console hardware that has somewhat middling ray tracing performance, perhaps this is the best path to high frame rates. A strategic though impactful deployment of a handful of RT effects, delivered with somewhat compromised quality. A similar RT implementation surfaced in last year's Resident Evil Village after all, and that title mostly stuck to 60 FPS on PS5 and Series X. As much as I might respect the effort here, performance is just too shaky at the moment to recommend actually playing the game in these modes on a normally refreshed display. The Series X code on a VRR display can fare okay, as the game is usually above 40 FPS, but this is only going to be a good solution for a small minority of users.
Oh, come on. Not again.
But what if we simply cut out the RT support, reverted back to the old techniques, and pushed for a locked 60 FPS? Capcom offers users this choice in a discrete performance profile that users can activate by disabling the options for ray tracing and high frame rate. Resolution is still at the old metrics here, roughly 4K on Series X and PS5, and 1440p on Series S, with a form of image reconstruction on all consoles. No big gain in image quality then, but we do take a graphical hit with the reintroduction of screen space reflections. The screen space reflections are still pretty shaky here relative to the old One X code. Boosted resolution typically means better SSR, and the results are certainly more temporally stable with less image breakup in stationary shots. But the actual coverage is a bit mixed. Reflected screen elements do show more fine detail, but there's often more gaps and breakup in the reflection itself. It's an odd result for sure. RTGI is absent as well, of course, though its loss is less keenly felt. The upside of these changes is that these modes run at a perfect 60 FPS on current-gen machines. Playing through some intense sections in the early game, I couldn't spot any performance dips, even on the Series S. Image quality in these versions isn't that much different than the PS4 Pro or One X versions, but performance is certainly more consistent. The last mode is dubbed High Frame Rate in the game's options, but what does it actually do? Curiously, this option doesn't seem to change any visual settings relative to the last mode we discussed. There's still no RT, and the 4K 1440p resolution split seems to make a return yet again. The big change here is that the performance cap has been raised. The new performance target is 120 FPS. Though without some settings downgrades to back it up, the actual results are somewhat mixed. PS5 and Series X both tend to stick between 80 to 120 FPS, though they usually hang around 100 FPS or so. Series S is similar, though it tends to bottom out a little bit lower, with some readings in the 70s in intense moments. Between Series X and PS5, the frame rates are fairly similar, though the Series X tends to have a small performance advantage in matching footage, around 5 FPS, though it does vary somewhat. This mode essentially unlocks the underlying performance of these games. Hitting a consistent 60 FPS usually entails operating well above 60 the majority of the time in most titles, and this is a particularly strong example, with frame rates peaking at 120 FPS in smaller scale scenes once we lift the frame rate cap. The improved image response and fluidity is certainly appreciated, but again, this is a mode best suited for use on VRR displays. As frame rates increase, frame time inconsistencies become less prominent, and the perception of jitter decreases, but I still found the unlocked frame rate distracting on a normally refreshed TV. VRR saves the day, of course, and will give you a smooth and stable feeling output on a suitable screen. I do like the option to play with a 120 FPS target, but a more stable lock to the target frame rate would have been appreciated. We're not very likely to be CPU limited given the performance of these titles on the last-gen enhanced machines, so some graphical settings tweaks might have been enough to produce a stable 120 FPS. The new versions of the Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 remakes are a bit curious. There's some decent improvements here, with solid upgrades to graphical fidelity and performance available across all three consoles, even the Series S. The problem is that frame rates are just too inconsistent across two of the three available modes, with both the ray tracing and high frame rate modes typically failing to reach their target frame rate. Most users should really stick to the non-RT, non-high frame rate profile here, as it's the only way to achieve stable performance. If you are part of the minority of users who has a display that is capable of VRR, and is capable of 120Hz, and has good implementations of those features that present without significant compromises, you have more options. The 120Hz mode offers a sizable upgrade in fluidity over the 60Hz non-RT mode, as long as VRR is enabled. Likewise, VRR helps salvage the RT modes to some degree, though only the Series X paired with a 40 to 60Hz VRR window is stable feeling enough to be worth recommending. But VRR should be a bonus, not a necessity. With some tweaks, more stable performance should be possible in these modes. Cutting resolution may be a good place to start, as the game's dark and low contrast color scheme plus their heavy reliance on post-processing minimizes the need to push a lot of pixels. As it stands though, the RT and high frame rate modes really demand a variable refresh to look smooth. And I think that's a bit of a shame, because these modes present some compelling features. The RT modes are particularly appealing, as they manage to overcome one of the more annoying visual flaws with the original releases, and improve the complexity and consistency of ambient shading as well. Resident Evil 3 especially benefits with its high density of reflective surfaces. Perhaps these performance problems can be fixed in time. Until then, this is an intriguing upgrade, but you'll need an advanced display to truly take advantage of it. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. To view a high-quality version of this video, check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.